What do you do when there's nowhere to run and hide? When an entity will follow you everywhere? In part 1 of the Surrency family haunting, a malevolent spirit has taken over the family's farmhouse and turned their lives upside down. Each one of the family members becoming increasingly more terrified by the day. But it was Clementine, the Surrency's daughter, who was about 15 years old at the time, who seemed to be at the center of the poltergeist activity. Objects would be thrown at her, furniture would shake and move on its own in her presence, but it was night that she claimed it was the most terrifying. Something would grab at her hair, yank the blankets off of her. One evening, the entity got so aggressive, Clementine herself was pulled straight off the mattress onto the floor, and the entire bed flipped. The whole house obviously heard this commotion and came running to find Clementine on the floor, and the bed overturned. After this, Miss Surrency saw that Clementine was being targeted, so she took her daughter and the two stayed with their son-in-law at his house, a man named Mr. Patterson, thinking that getting Clementine out of the farmhouse, she would be safe. But hauntingly, the entity followed them to Mr. Patterson's house. As soon as Miss Surrency and Clementine got there, his house became ravaged by the poltergeist as well. Objects began flying off the shelves, furniture rising and crashing to the floor, and during this period, the activity back at the farmhouse ceased. For the family, this validated their theory that Clementine was the target. Now, poltergeist activity very commonly centers around one family, particularly one person, and very often it's a girl, usually in her preteen or teen years. Eventually, Clementine and Miss Surrency returned to the farmhouse, and the entity followed them right back. That has to be one of the most anxiety-provoking aspects of a haunting like this, that the entity will follow you wherever you go. There's no escaping it. The family, tormented, tried everything really. They packed up and moved to another house on the farm's property, but what do we think happened? They had a couple weeks of peace there until the activity began in that house as well. And again, during all of this, they were very wary of letting anyone know about what was going on inside the house. They tried to keep this really private. They didn't tell many people because they didn't want the community to think less of them. As we touched on, Alan was a prominent member in the town. He had lived there with his wife for years, ran businesses, had a very trusted reputation. So he didn't want his family's issues to be publicized. But the fact was, his children were petrified. And no matter where they went, the activity followed them. They were trapped. Eventually, the family did begin divulging what had been going on, and the local newspaper got wind of it. And sure enough, the family's paranormal activity made for big headlines all over the South. Front page articles read, "The most haunted house in Georgia," and "Ghost activity ravages Surrency family." People in this small town and surrounding Georgia counties were intrigued by this. Journalists, paranormal investigators began showing up at the Surrency's front door. And at this point, Alan was so desperate for help, he let investigators and reporters inside, hoping that maybe they could help. They weren't enjoying the notoriety, but wanted the activity to end. One reporter who visited the Surrency's home recounted his experience inside. He claimed as he was making his way around, he found himself in front of the family's clock that sat on the mantle, and watched as its hands spun rapidly, just as the family had witnessed over the past months. He reported the clock's hands were spinning at a rate of 5 hours in a single minute. Now, this reporter was hoping to disprove this entire thing, because that would be one heck of a headline. So he opened up the clock, hoping to find a way this could be a trick. This clock had to be rigged by the family, but this reporter said he found nothing, nor any sign that this was faked. And he left that day thoroughly creeped out. When discussing how or why this was happening to the Surrencys, some suspected maybe the family's home sat on a ley line, or some kind of powerful magnetic grid. Day after day, hundreds of people continued to show up at the Surrency's farmhouse in that fall of 1872, one after another. This haunting became such a popular story that the train depot nearby made a designated train to take those interested to the farmhouse. It was big news. When arriving at the home, the train conductor would say to the passengers, "Welcome to Ghostville." One man visited the house quite frequently. His name was Charles H. Foster, who was a spiritualist medium, and he came from a little town drenched in paranormal history, Salem, Massachusetts. Ever heard of it? Foster actually stayed at the farmhouse with the family for a week. They were hoping that he could get to the bottom of things. During his time there, he claimed he made contact with the entities within the home. And he said these entities indicated that the Surrencys were sensitive, mediumistic, specifically Clementine. But others believed that it was actually not Clementine who was at the center of this. Some theorized it was actually Mrs. Surrency, as she was present and in the house for all of the activity. And she was the first person to experience the activity in the home earlier that summer. This was all widely debated in the papers as well. It should be said that during this, the Surrencys didn't make any money off of this haunting. No profits, they weren't paid by anyone to investigate the house, they didn't charge people to tour. Actually, according to many, they turned down offers to pay them to investigate and tour the home. They always maintained that they never wanted publicity, they didn't want fame, they just wanted this entity out of the home and for the activity to end. They were tired, they were at their wits' end. And they were also wondering, why us? But eventually, as it goes, months passed and the story became old news. People eventually stopped caring. But the activity within the home reportedly continued for years, until Mr. Surrency passed away in 1877. There was never any explanation for the activity, the torment the family went through, and through the years, it became lost in history, but undoubtedly remains one of the most documented hauntings in history, given how many people visited the house, how many people witnessed the paranormal activity firsthand. This haunting was in a class of its own at the time. And even in today's world, a haunting of this magnitude is pretty remarkable. Eventually, the Surrencys up and left the house, and afterwards, the home sat abandoned for many years. And decades later, the farmhouse burned to the ground, destroyed by a fire in 1925. In the end, many believe that the family was haunted, tormented, stalked by a malevolent poltergeist. Based on how aggressive the entity was, the physical disturbances in the home, many who have looked at this case believe that this was much more than just a haunted house. This was something much darker, evil. Typically, this type of activity starts with smaller, isolated events, like Miss Surrency witnessing the pitcher in the wash bowl rock back and forth and then shatter on the ground. And over time, the activity will grow with intensity and severity. Poltergeist activity will typically last for months, but other times it can last for years. As we touched on, it usually centers around one individual, often female. Some people believe that poltergeists are angry, aggressive spirits trying to get attention, but others believe they're much darker, evil, more demonic. And though this haunting took place decades ago, there's one aspect that still remains. In town, they call it the Surrency Ghost Light, or Surrency Spook Light, a mysterious light that reportedly appears along the railroad tracks, a reminder of the town's paranormal history. Per reports, it's a strange, mysterious yellow ball of light that can be seen hovering over the Surrency train tracks. Apparently, if you see the light, you cannot approach it because it will immediately disappear. Many have seen it, and legend says that Clementine Surrency herself was the first to see the light in 1872, the same year the haunting began. Story goes, one night she went down to the train station to meet her father as he was returning home from work one evening. And as she waited, she looked down the tracks, anticipating seeing the incoming train lights, but instead, she claimed she saw a light in the shape of a man dressed in all white, coming straight towards her. She got so scared she ran back home. Now this is incredibly interesting, because this ties into Clementine possibly being mediumistic, sensitive, and brings in a whole new question. Was this haunting tied to the family, the farmhouse, the land, or the train tracks, the town in general? definitely makes you wonder. And it's said that this light can still be seen to this day. A last remnant of the haunting that captivated this small little southern town so many decades ago. And it remains a part of the town's history. But I gotta know, what are your thoughts on the Surrency family haunting? This is one of the most intense cases of poltergeist activity I've ever heard of, so I would love to know your thoughts. Where do you believe the activity came from? Do you think it was tied to the family or the town? Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments. You all always bring such great insight into these cases. Ideas that I hadn't even thought of. I would be so grateful if you subscribe to this channel, leave a like and a comment, and turn on post notifications so you never miss out on an episode. And let me know what haunted spots you want to see next on the show. Next episode, I've got so much more spookiness coming your way. Until then, I'm Avery Ross, and this is Avery After Dark.